Hey everyone, welcome back to the Other Autism podcast. I have a bit of a cold today, but I wanted to make sure to get this out as I'll be away next month. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Paula Holmes-Rodman, an anthropologist, consultant, writer, and practitioner of narrative-based medicine based in British Columbia, Canada. But before I share our conversation, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Pam and Sana for each buying me 3 coffees through the Buy Me a Coffee link. Thank you both so much. If you would also like to buy me a coffee, please check out the link in the show notes that says Buy Me a Coffee. And with that, please say hello to my guest for today, Dr. Paula Holmes-Rodman.
I'm really excited to be here. Honored. I know that you usually interview only people who identify as autistic, so I'm not. I know that we use the word neurotypical. I'm Paula, I'm Paula Holmes-Rodman. But the word neurotypical means that like there's sort of an atypical. So let's just call me not autistic. I am an anthropologist. I'm an ethnographer. I'm a caregiver. I was a caregiver and I am a caregiver still. And I'm a practitioner of narrative medicine, and I'm a writer as well. And I'm an advocate for people who experience barriers to really equitable cancer care. And that includes the autistic people as well. And I work in the oncology space for a lot of equity and advocacy work right now. So it's kind of a second career, although my first career was in New Mexico and Arizona working with Indigenous women and looking at post-colonial Indigenous identities, medical narratives, and really complex and competing ideas of the miraculous. So this is a bit of a second career for me, and working in the cancer world.
Thank you. And for people who don't know, could you explain more about narrative-based medicine? What does that entail?
Oh gosh, yeah, we need a whole hour for that. Sure. Narrative medicine is really just the understanding that we are storied creatures, all of us. So that whatever medical or end of life illness experience that we have, there is usually more, always more. There's more, there's the rest of the story, right? So there's whatever the healthcare providers understand and is recorded in our medical charts. But then there's the fully human experience of it. So, how do we communicate about our healthcare? How do we represent it? What does it mean to pay attention to a storied understanding of healthcare? And it has a lot to do with expressive writing, with paying attention to text as well, and understanding the illness experience also as a text. So that's sort of, I'm doing it through the University of Toronto, and I'm interested in primarily also in cancer narratives and end of life narratives as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And could you explain how and when your connection with autism began?
Yeah, it's interesting when I saw this question. It's like, well, I'm sure I've always known autistic people, but obviously it began with my sister, Lindsay. Lindsay was 4.5 years older than me, but we didn't grow up knowing she was autistic. Obviously, she always was autistic. She wasn't diagnosed until 49. So I didn't grow up going to school with, I think there was probably a special needs class, and those kids were ghettoed, corralled as different. But the word of like, hey, there's some autistic people among our midst, and they might need some accommodations, and their brains work differently, and might have some sensory issues. That's not how I grew up. And really, my understanding of autism started with my sister, with Lindsay. And she sought her own diagnosis. She received that at 49. And that was basically because she wanted it for herself. So it was really understanding Lindsay's understanding and her unique experience of autism, that, which of course is, she used to say, you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, right? As we all know. Understanding autism through her lens and through her experience encouraged me to say, well, what else does this look like? What else does this feel like? So that sort of was the beginning of it. But obviously, we've all known people who are autistic all throughout our lives. And I'm sure I went to school with them, and there's probably some even in my own family. But really, via Lindsay is the primary answer to that one.
And how did that change things for her, if at all?
The diagnosis?
Yeah, like her understanding of herself or any challenges she was having.
For Lindsay, sort of one of the things is there was a siren call of normal. Okay, so normal. She really wanted to be normal. And I think looking at the way that she was raised is that our mother was very young when she had her. She was 21 in Missouri in the 60s. And she knew something was different, something was unusual about her daughter, and kept taking her to doctors saying, basically, fix my child. And the doctors were very like, well, it's fine. It's fine. It's probably you are the problem. You are the mother that's the problem. And she's perfectly nice. There's nothing wrong with your child. Of course, I wasn't privy to that as the younger child. I wasn't involved in those conversations. But I think that the things that my mom did to support my sister growing up were things to make her more normal. And my mother has since passed away, and I wish I could talk to her about this more, but not out of cruelty, not out of, I don't like you, so I want to change you, but more that she saw the struggling and she saw the bullying and she didn't want that. You don't want that for your child. So, can you act more normal so that people aren't mean to you? You are accepted. You have employment and love and all of the things that, we want for our children. So I think, but Lindsay always knew there was something different about her. And I don't know exactly what it was that started that searching for diagnosis process. But when she received it, she sought it out from I believe he was a psychologist who was also himself autistic. And for her, I think it was more of like a lovely homecoming. Like, that makes sense. But it wasn't what she didn't do was then turn around and seek community, turn around and look for other autistic people and say, oh, okay, you are my people, right? And how can we form a community? So I think for her, it was sort of more like, hey, I'm not crazy. I'm not broken. I am autistic. So I think there was more of a homecoming, a retrospective homecoming is the way that I would describe it. But she still wanted all of the same things that she wanted to work and she wanted ultimately love and good health and, all of the things that we all want. And she felt that, like all of us, that we deserve those things. And that her very strong work ethic and force of will could achieve those things for her. And she used to speak about her autism part, right? She says, my autism is showing, my autism part. And I never really thought about sort of how funny that was because I wanted to say, honey, all of your parts are autism parts. They all are, right? But for her, that now upon reflection tells me that there was a little bit of disjuncture, disjointing, I guess is the word, dissonance between those things that she perceived to be as her autism parts, as her autism being showing, which is an interesting way of saying that. And one of the times I really remember her saying that was the last time she saw our mother, which was clearly the last time she was going to see her alive prior to her death. And she was really struggling. And she kept saying, my autism is showing. And I said, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah, this is tough. Of course it's tough. This just sucks. There's no way around it. And you can struggle and blank out and melt down and shut down and do all of the things because we're in it. Like we are in this emotional kind of space. But the bottom line is I think that she always felt, again, that siren call of normal and a little bit of disjuncture from some other part of her that was sort of deemed to be autistic. And she did struggle with that, I believe, all of her life, although that was more integrated towards the end of her life.
It makes me think of the concept of masking. So
Yes.
I know
Yeah.
that's a relatively new one in the autistic community. So maybe
Yeah.
I don't know how much she's thought of that for herself because it sounds like what she's saying is like, my mask is coming off here.
Yes. Yeah. The language of masking and unmasking was the language that we used in about the last year of her life, I would say. So she died in April of this year and 2024. So the last year of her life, she would say, yeah, why should I mask? Why should I have to? And that actually came up with, so she lost her job prior to, we're kind of skipping ahead a little bit, prior to recurrence coming back. So for her looking for employment and that masking, unmasking disclosing, not disclosing discussion, I think was part of that identity work that was happening prior to her cancer recurrence. So that was part of her language, I think, towards the end as well.
I know Lindsay was diagnosed with cancer, and that
Yeah.
included an initial diagnosis of ovarian cancer. Is that okay to say? I think you've
Oh,
said, okay,
absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
no problem.
Um,
Yeah.
and a recurrence in the form of brain cancer. So early on in this journey, you set out to record your conversations with Lindsay, and that turned into the Lindsay interview project, which folks can watch on YouTube. You then found yourself using the content of those conversations to form what became the Self-Advocacy Guide for cancer patients on the autism spectrum. And I know I've been a cancer patient. I would have loved to have that at that time. I'd love to hear more about the process of creating that and where the guide is at now.
Well, we ended up creating the thing that we wish we had had,
Right.
right? So, I mean, I think that's the short version of it too. But yeah, so Lindsay was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2019. And one thing that's interesting, just to back up a little bit, speaking of stories that go around in circles, is that I think that's interesting to say that if you have people who are late diagnosed, self-realized with their autism, and then you have a cancer diagnosis that kind of comes to town within a couple of years. So you've got somebody who has cancer in, often, I mean, you kind of people who are young that have cancer diagnoses, but often they tend to be sort of late, later in life. If you've got all of these people wandering around in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they're like, hey, I just realized I'm autistic. And wait, now I have cancer. So these are people who have not grown up. They're not diagnosed at 3 or 4. They haven't received support and accommodations, and they don't have that language of masking and unmasking. And these are my needs. They haven't grown up in that system. And then suddenly they're thrust into this incredibly, fully foreign world of the cancer care system, which is foreign for anybody, even if you're not autistic. And so suddenly you're supposed to be, wait, I'm supposed to be able to articulate about my sensory needs and the way that I communicate and I process, but I just learned that language, or I'm learning that language and I'm learning the way who I am and the way my brain works. And wait, now I have this biomedical crisis of cancer. It's all happening at the same time. So I think that was the sort of come to Jesus moment, as they call it, for me. That's like, wait a minute, this must be happening for more than one person in the world. How can I use my ethnographic powers for good? So that was part of it. Part of it was I wanted to give Lindsay the opportunity, someone who really, they never really asked her opinion, never really thought she had much to say about the world. And I remember when I started the interviews, my husband said, you're going to get 2 words out of her. And I said, no, we'll see. Well, we got 2 hours that first time. I mean, I love these interviews. They are a mess. They're a hot mess. They were never meant to be anything but like transcribed. And they were sort of meant to be like our Sunday hangout phone calls. So we have snacks and cats walking through and bad lighting and like words to our imaginary sponsors and so much like laughter and love and tears. And like there's just everything in them. And yeah, we talk about autism and cancer. They were started to be a legacy project in part, but they also started, I wanted to know what she thought could be better, how the process could have been better for her, because we did our best. And when when you have a cancer diagnosis, you don't prepare for it. Suddenly you're like, oh, it's happening. It is happening. So when we were in the big city cancer center, I remember taking the nurse aside, telling the nurse, my sister's autistic. She's going to need a little help. But I didn't know what I was asking. Honestly, I didn't know I couldn't even articulate as the sister and caregiver what I needed. And I didn't know if that information was ever received, if it was transcribed, translated, what happened to it. I just needed to say something. So in my fantasy land, the next Lindsay and Paula who walk into a cancer center and the next caregiver or, support person who takes that nurse aside and says, my person, my loved one who just has this cancer diagnosis and their world is just rock and they're autistic, they get the guide. And maybe it helps them a little bit. that either they and their support people can fill it out, can just, in a quiet moment say, hey, this is the way I process, and this is what I need for planning and predictability. And this is what I think about place. And this is, I can go through the 10 P's, bring it back to that healthcare encounter and feel a little bit more empowered, have a little bit more language, a little bit more ability to speak about what it is that their unique version of autism requires to be more fully supported in that cancer experience. So that's sort of the fantasy. But how we got there, the interviews were, they started in 2022, and then I did them a year again later, just to check in and say, how's it going? And then the third one was 6 months after that, after recurrence had happened. She had a very rare brain metastasis, which is a unique expression of ovarian cancer, about 1% to 2% chance. And so the last one I reported in the hospice, actually. So the interviews sort of go over about a 2.5 year period in the middle of a 4 year cancer experience. Where the guide came from is I was transcribing that first couple of interviews. How do I express pages and pages and pages of a single person's experience, which it is just a single person's experience, into something that could be useful. Plus, at the same time, I was starting to do research, and there isn't much about autism and cancer, other than the fact that we know that autistic people have the same bad chance of getting cancer as anybody else in the population, but they tend to have about a 2-to-1 poorer outcome. So that's not a biology problem. That's a healthcare problem. How are they being cared for and why? So how can we affect change there? The problem is that the burden of self-advocacy in a broken system is a burden. And this is the problem. You've got cancer, here's your homework, right? I don't love that. And I think that ideally, so this is why we need to both give the patient a useful tool, hopefully it's useful, and their support people. And we also need to be educating the healthcare providers to say, hey, if you have autistic patients, they may need the following things. Things may look different, sound different, feel different, experience differently. So we need both a patient-facing and provider-facing educational opportunities and tools for this to get better for the next rounds of people who experience cancer as autistic people.
Just curious to go back to, you were talking about the sort of having the autism diagnosis close to the cancer diagnosis. So yeah. I've heard that that's the case. That was the case for me, but in a slightly different order. So my cancer came first and then autism a couple years later, or a few years later. But they were definitely connected in terms of like the cancer journey kind of showing me, wow, I don't have the coping skills I thought I had, and I feel like I'm handling this different than other people I'm meeting. But I've heard that cancer or other, medical crises or other life crises kind of happen side by side. So in your eyes, like, why do you think that happens so often?
Yeah, I don't know. Actually, I have heard that there's a woman I know in the UK, and she had a breast cancer experience, and it was through her experience of breast cancer that she then sought her own autism diagnosis as well. But yeah, it is interesting to think that when you get that biomedical crisis, or maybe it's some other kind of life crisis, a divorce, a death of a loved one, or something or other, that you're right. You think, maybe I'm not coping. Maybe what's wrong? The what's wrong with me question, right? Why am I not doing this the way that I think I should be, so-called should be doing this? That maybe encourages people to just say, how does the world work for me? Well, how does my brain work? So I don't know. I wouldn't like to speak for others in this situation, but it does occur to me that, yeah, you've got all of these people. And I remember Lindsay and I talked a lot about that. We have 2 little nieces, and we thought, well, if they are so unfortunate, like that they are going to go through an educational system that will support them if they were to have any learning challenges, any sort of, neurological differences, we hope that they will be better supported as children, so that when and if they had any biomedical crises, we hope that will be more integrated later on. but it isn't right now. It's sort of like you're still treated as we're interested in your tumors, your little lumps of rogue cells, but I don't really care about the rest of you that is housed in. And I certainly don't care about how you experience the world. That's sort of the way it is right now. But in fact, it really does matter. It matters everything, everything from the expression of pain to decision making and consent to compliance with if you are able, willing, able, possible to attend and even just understand what you're being offered in terms of treatments, that sort of thing. So it really does underlie, underscore, hold up everything. And I think that's one of the things is to say that, well, autistic doesn't matter if you've got cancer. It actually matters a lot. In the same way, it's sort of like a social determinant of health. We start talking a lot about the fact if you don't have stable housing, if you don't have these sorts of things, it matters because, it underscores that whole health system is how you experience it. And it is also a barrier to appropriate care because you have, for example, for Lindsay's experience, she didn't have a family doctor. So she was going through the walk-in system. So she was diagnosed very late at a late stage cancer, which is true for many ovarian cancers. But again, she didn't have that. There was that medical mistrust, which is common for many autistic people, that I don't feel like I can show up as my full self. And then cancer comes to town. So you're already kind of behind the times. And then you're supposed to be navigating this whole new foreign world of cancer care.
Yeah, it's very, very challenging. I know for me with the cancer thing, it seemed like, well, for my whole life, I kind of felt different. And I'd had a lot of challenging and traumatic experiences. And so my brain would tell stories to myself of like, this is why you're different because of XYZ. But then when I had cancer, and so the physical stuff is happening, and you're now like, your normal coping skills are getting bombarded by way too much information and challenges from all different directions. I think that broke down my ability to mask. And so I just felt like I don't even know how to describe it, raw in a certain way. And then just I would lose my ability to respond to the doctors. And I was like, what is that? Like, that's not just past traumas. Like there's something else going on here. And it's very scary for all of that to be happening at the same time. And then also, we might get into this later, but like having a spouse or a partner that wasn't very helpful for various reasons and, their own toxicity and things like that. So, which doesn't help.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. That really resonates with what I observed in Lindsay. And this is what I call, what she and I came to call the yep, yep, yep response.
Totally.
Okay. In which, and I think that this is interesting. So Lindsay really wanted to be, again, it's that siren call of normal, to be well, to be the perfect patient. This is like what happens when you get masking, social camouflaging, enacted wellness, mashing up with cancer. Oh, heck no. And guess what? You are the perfect patient. So if you are the oncology healthcare provider and you are my patient, and I'm giving you a whole bunch of information, and you're sitting there going, yep, 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 yep. Fantastic. I'm out of the room in 5 minutes. Great. Now, how much of that information have you taken in? Hey, not so much. How free do you feel to say, hey, I didn't understand that? You're literally speaking a way that I don't understand. I need to see it verbally. I need to have it orally. I need to see a video. I need you to talk to me more slowly. I need to speak to you twice. I need to have my support person, or I don't need to have my support person. How free do you feel to say those things to me as your oncology healthcare provider if you have been trained all of your life, particularly as someone born into a female body, to be the untroubled, perfectly good patient? Not so much. So part of, again, the self-advocacy guide is to stop that yep, yep, yep response. And if the answer is yep, gotcha, fine, great, next is great. But sometimes the answer is I didn't get that and I actually don't understand and I have questions and I don't agree. And we need to give space for all of that as well and a language for that to happen in.
For sure. Yeah, it's like the people pleasing thing that so many of us
Yeah,
do. So it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
autistic females or people born female, it seems that we have that even like times 10.
Hmm.
I think all women have that to some degree, but for autistic women, it's almost like we have that to a pathological level, I would say.
I would
It's part
agree.
of the mask.
Yeah. And so when you get that in a cancer space, it actually is detrimental actually, it can be detrimental to the outcomes, I think.
Totally. Yeah, I can see that for sure. I know that people are going to want to know where to get the guide.
I'm so excited. I actually feel very emotional about this because Lindsay and I spoke about it on her last night on Earth. She says, I really want the guide to come out. And I said, yeah, I'm not going to cry. I said, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. So I'm very, very grateful that Autism Canada is using its digital wizards to make it happen. And it will be available free of charge on their site. You can download it. There will be a fillable PDF as well as something you can print out and write in, depending on how your brain works, right? Depending on what you need. So it has 10 sections with, I think, a total of 77 questions, which is a lot of questions. And there's also a resource guide at the end, which hopefully, might be helpful for some people. Everything from lists of things that you could put in a comfort go bag, right? Because if you're spending a lot of time in a hospital, in an emergency room, which is miserable for anybody. If you have some little bit of predictability and planning, it's like, oh yeah, these are the things that I need. And you're going back and forth to do chemo or radiation, or you're doing a lot of appointments. What can you put in your bag, literally, to make sure that you're more comfortable? The guide will be available on the 20th this month. And the other idea is we're going to have posters in the big city cancer centers with the QR code. And that I also will be working with my contacts through the sort of the cancer care world to make sure that because when you're first diagnosed with a cancer, it's a cancer, right? You're not just diagnosed with cancer, it'll be ovarian or breast or something or other. So we want to make sure that if you're accessing a patient support group, if you're accessing Ovarian Cancer Canada or, a breast cancer support group, that there's something that says, oh, are you autistic? And also, has this cancer, this is for you, and that you will be sort of guided that way. But it will be available on Autism Canada's site, free of charge, downloadable, fillable. So I hope that people use it, ask for it, and I hope that it's useful. Not every question is going to be useful for every person. I also see it as a living document. So I've tried to use the most inclusive language possible. We had a number of people through Autism Canada who are autistic themselves give me a lot of feedback and loop back and like, oh, you forgot this part, you forgot what about this? I'm like, okay, good, tell me everything. I want to know it all. This is just a one person show with Lindsay's me running it by Lindsay as well. I see it as a living document that is not going to be helpful for everyone, but I hope that some parts are helpful for some people. And the underlying question is basically, what do you want your healthcare provider to know about you that is not on your medical chart? So it's a kind of parallel chart. And I think particularly for autistic people with that word comorbidity, we don't have comorbidities, we have co-occurring conditions. And just for example, a little side story, when Lindsay had her brain tumor symptoms, because she was autistic, it was like, those are panic attacks. That's stress. That's your autism speaking. Like, actually, no, those are brain tumors. And even when she was in hospice for brain tumors and the symptoms started up again, and it was so obvious to me and our family members, like, well, clearly this is what's going on. It's stress. It's panic attacks. She's autistic. Like, well, we are aware of those things, but perhaps it's also the thing that she's actually in hospice for. So this noise of co-occurring condition is noisy, I guess to say. So part of the purpose of the guide is to say, yeah, I have co-occurring conditions and they are they are these things. And they may or may not influence what's going on in the cancer space, what's going on with my cancer experience. But let me take a little bit of charge here and say, I'm going to tell you about it rather than you tell me about it as my healthcare provider. So yeah, I've got some epilepsy or I've got this or I've got that and I have anxiety or I have this or I have that, or I don't. and I need you to take me seriously. Ideally empowering, if it works well, that is my hope and my goal. And then it's also an educational tool for healthcare providers. Because if you are an oncology healthcare provider and your patient walks in with one of these guides and says, "Hey, I filled this thing out, and I need you to listen to me in the following ways," maybe that might ultimately affect some change. And then we're ultimately moving towards that goal of more equitable healthcare, which we all talk a great deal about, but none of us really know how to get there. So again, we can empower the patients and at the same time we can educate the healthcare providers. So that's the hope of the guide. But primarily, I hope that if you are autistic and you're diagnosed with cancer, that it is of use to you.
I had a look at the draft that you sent, it
Oh,
looked
good.
really great. What I liked about it too is it was really easy to use. Like I went through it and kind of imagining myself filling that out as a cancer patient. And what struck me is that it's very comprehensive. It talks about it goes through all the different things you should be considering. And it would have been so useful to me because I know I had tunnel vision most of the time through that whole experience. So I just want to tell people, like, if they are interested in looking at it, that's what you're going to see. It's very easy to use, very
Okay.
comprehensive. And also, I think it would apply to a lot more than cancer. So you can take those questions and use it for a lot of other conditions.
Yeah, I think thank you for that. I'm glad that you found it that useful. Thank you. But I also think that I think one of my hopes is to adapt it for more than cancer. And I have had some feedback on that, that it is a more than cancer helpful situation. Because really, when you're talking about things like predictability, planning, processing, place, it's got the 10 P's just to be kind of catchy and cool, that some of them are specific cancer related. Like when we're talking about pain, maybe you express pain differently. Maybe those awful pain scales don't work for you. Maybe those little smiley faces, the frowny faces, oh Lord, that does not work for an autistic person, for some autistic people. But if you are recovering, if you have MS, if you have any other kind of symptoms, or if you have a heart attack, or you have any other kind of medical condition, a lot of these issues, if you're marching your way through the healthcare system, they're still relevant. So some of them are cancer specific, but not all of the questions are. So yeah, I think that it could be quite easily adapted. It is for adults, or I guess teens and up, but it could be adapted to more healthcare conditions. So if you have a serious medical condition that you are, and you're sort of navigating through a complex healthcare situation, look at the guide and see, it might be helpful for you.
And what can listeners do to support Lindsay's hopes and visions for the guide specifically?
Well, use it. I mean, I know that she would hope you don't get cancer, um, but uh, but if you do, use the guide, and I hope that it's useful to you. I really do. And one of the ironic and sort of funny, beautiful, wonderful things is that after she had recurrence, we were still consulting our own guide. We were in the middle of it. There we were in the acute neurosurgery ward and in the hospital, like, wait a minute, what did we say about this? And I mean, it's sort of ironic and funny, but also true. So it's something that is a kind of a generative, iterative process. It's like, we have to revisit this. It's like, you think you've got I know what I need for planning and predictability. I know how my brain works for processing. But as those challenges come along, as your health either improves or deteriorates, you get other challenges or questions, revisit it, rethink it. Don't see it as a done deal. See it as something that you can also learn from. Because I think that when we had the guide and then we did the guide ourselves, which was created from the interviews, we learned things from answering the questions. So I think that it can lead to quite a bit of self insight about how you kind of move and work in the world and what you need to be successful in a healthcare setting. And so ask for it, use it, look for it, and I hope that you find it useful.
To kind of change the direction here, I just wanted to know about Lindsay's sort of broader hopes and visions for autistic people. Like, what are some of the main messages she wanted broadcast?
Well, Lindsay was a dreamer for sure. She really believed in social justice. She believed that people should be valued and treated and loved for exactly who they were. And she actually just didn't talk the talk. She did it. There was nobody better on your team. If Lindsay was on your team, she was on your team. So if you had a success, like your cat ate the new cat food, like she was cheering you on, let alone something like really amazing happened in your life. There was nobody better. So the cheering each other on in those really authentic ways. And the same thing is if something bad happened to you, like she would be the person. I mean, she would be in hospice asking me how my life is going. I'm like, well, actually, it's okay comparatively. So I love that about her. And I always try to think of that now that she's gone. It's like, how can I embody that spirit? What does it mean to really be on somebody's team, to just show up in that authentic way and to really value I mean, this sounds like very Hallmark card bumper stickers, but to value those little things like those were amazing waffles, or my cats are so cute, or there's a beautiful sunrise, or I found this amazing thing at the thrift store, and actually celebrate those things. Actually celebrate those things for ourselves and for other people. And because a lot of us kind of talk about that a lot, but very few of us actually do that. And Lindsay really did. And that was a beautiful thing. And one of the things I miss the most about her, I think. And she really believed in the possibility that, I mean, in some ways, sometimes in a little bit of a naive way, it's like, well, if we all just get along and we all just support each other, I'm like, oh, it's not so easy. But, I love that spirit. I love that sort of almost unadulterated belief in the possibility of the goodness of human beings. And so she was disappointed when human beings weren't good. She really thought that they could be better, that they should be better, that we all have the capability to do that. I mean, it sounds a little saccharine, I guess, to say all of this, but that's truly who she was. And I think that spirit is something that we can embody.
It sounds like she had a lot of resilience, even though it sounds like things were often very hard for her growing up and not feeling
Yeah.
normal. And to have that resilience and that spirit of optimism is very awesome to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. She used to say, I've been hanging in there since 1966, And so, I mean, that was sort of her, right? It was just sort of like, watch me, like,
Mhm.
just watch me. Like, and I mean, she never swore. I have a mouth of a sailor, but, she didn't swear. But it was sort of a big sort of almost like an F you to the world, like, it's like, I could do this. And you can't tell me I can't. And there's no reason I can't. And I mean, that had to do also with beating cancer. So I think part of the problem was when the cancer came back was she was really disappointed, like almost personally offended that it had come back. Like she had done something wrong. And I'm like,
Mm.
no, 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 no. This wasn't a personal failing. But no, she really had a lot of resilience and a lot of, because when you rely on that work ethic, that like, why not? I can totally do this. And so I try to embody a lot of that spirit when I'm feeling a little kind of, yeah, I can't.
Yeah,
So
for sure, for sure. One very challenging aspect of Lindsay's life that you shared in a video post for Advanced Care Planning Canada earlier this year is that Lindsay was married to someone who was emotionally abusive to her. And I think you also mentioned financially abusive.
mhm.
So, how did you become aware of that abuse and how did it impact Lindsay from your perspective?
The video came about. I ran into somebody from advanced care planning at a psychosocial oncology conference, and they were talking about the equity work they were doing in advanced care planning. And I said, do you do anything for autistic people? And they said, no. And I said, well, we need to have a think about this because when we're talking about advanced care planning, we're talking about decision making and consent. We're talking about who has the right as adults to make decisions about their own health care and how can we make those decisions known, how can we express them, how can we make sure everybody's listening to our decisions. And that was challenged in Lindsay's cancer situation. The spouse that she married to late in life after being unmarried all of her life. And I was very happy that she found somebody to love. And I thought he was a little quirky, but, I was sort of the live and let live, and they had their routine and they had the things that they liked to do together. And I wanted Lindsay to be happy. And he had things that she valued, like a home and a car, and they got cats together. So, and I think she also felt very sorry for his story of being a victim for all of his life. And she was very loyal and she wanted and believed in love. And so I think everything, in my opinion, she was also very private, was going along just fine until cancer came to town, right? And then I lived in a different province and he was there and able to, take her to some appointments. And again, everything was sort of okay until recurrence happened. And when the recurrence happened with the brain tumor, the sort of precipitating incident, what happened in the acute neurosurgery ward. And a nurse said, basically advanced care planning, get your affairs in order, even though they had done a craniotomy, they had removed the tumor, they were going to do radiation, we're throwing everything at it. No one's writing off, no one's ending the story now, but statistically, this is probably the beginning of the end. And I took that very seriously because I believe very strongly that everybody should have the right to make their own medical decisions. Everybody. And her husband said, I'm the husband and I will make the decisions. And for me, that was a hell no. And I knew that from his past experience and what he had shared, that the medical decisions that he would make would be different from my sister's. And also that Lindsay's would be different from mine, and that's okay. Mine are irrelevant here, right? I mean, so mine are completely off the stage, but so are his, right? So what were important were Lindsay's. So that was my cue to make sure that Lindsay had the legal and the financial right to make her own decisions, which I did lock down for her. And she was able to make all of her own medical decisions. And one of the things I feel proudest of, although that's not quite the right word, and most emotional about, is that she was 5 months in hospice, in part because of the really unstable home environment by then, but that she made her own medical decisions right up until the end. And that it was the nurses and the doctors looking at her in the eyes, asking what she wanted. And her husband is texting me this crazy garbage. I'm like, yeah, that's not happening because the doctors are talking to her and she is saying what she wants. And that is what's going to happen. And that's what happened. And that was a beautiful thing. And I thought that is the final act of protection that I can do. I can't stop the cancer. I can't stop her dying at 57. Those aren't in my power. But what I can do is make sure that the medical professionals take her seriously and know that she has the complete capacity and ability to say, yeah, if you tell me what's going on in my brain and my body, what my options are, what my choices are, what the consequences are for my choices, if this, then that, if this, then that, absolutely she can understand. And she made choices. And she died in peace and surrounded with me by her side. Without him, I was her choice. And we had these beautiful family meetings in the hospice. Things went off the rails. There were violence threatened and police called, and it was kind of a bit of a rodeo. But we had these family meetings where Lindsay spoke up, spoke her truth in these family meetings with social workers and doctors and, everybody there, which of course was met with not a lot of happiness on his part, let's put it mildly. But she was speaking her truth in those last months. It was a beautiful thing. It was a beautiful thing, including just a few days before he died, was the last meeting. All of that I have a great deal of gratitude and grief for, to be honest. I have so much gratitude that that happened and grief that it didn't happen earlier. But it did happen, which tells me it can and should happen. And I hope that for every autistic person, the cautionary tale in this and the reason for that video, we hope it goes well and that you live another 40, 50, 60 years. But even so, we all have the right to make our own medical decisions. Even if you have the most loving, wonderful relationship, you still have the right to make your own medical decisions. And they may be different from your partner's. And that's okay. And it is worth having those conversations. And that's why it's built into the guide. Who helps you make decisions? How do you express consent is one of the questions. if I have an important decision in my life, I have people who I consult, who I rely on to help me. Nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, I want people to know that I'm the one that's going to say yes or no to something. And when we're talking about treatment for cancer, it really matters, or end of life care, particularly.
That's awesome. And it's hard to just sit here and not cry, but I'm trying really hard.
Oh, we can go. If we don't cry, we're not doing it right.
Well, I'm just imagining also like because you talked about how Lindsay had this need to be the perfect patient, and I think just
Yeah,
knowing what that feels like also in a relationship, wanting to be the perfect partner, the perfect wife,
yeah,
perfect girlfriend, and how that clouds your ability to see yourself as a human person too. Like, I'm a human and I need the same amount of care as anyone else, but it's just time and time again how often we just completely ignore our own needs for the other person. And so I went literal, in my experience, I went literal years without really acknowledging the behaviors of the other person as harmful, and damaging. And sometimes, I even think my cancer was caused by being with that person for the length of time that I was with them. And I just wonder how many other autistic people have that experience. I know from reading the research, which isn't like very personal, but there are stats out there that talk about just that we are more commonly find ourselves in relationships where we're being abused in some way. And some of it is it's so invisible because we're not being, physically abused. I wasn't physically abused, but manipulated and abused in other ways that are so much harder to see and so much harder for people around us to see. So it just like my heart's heavy just thinking of all the work that goes into covering for these people and then
hmm
also in our own mind covering for them. And then
hmm
when the reality finally hits, it's so hard to, now what do I do?
yeah,
Because in a lot of ways we rely on that person. I was lucky enough to be able to leave them financially, but it took several years, especially after cancer, to be on my feet financially again. So living with them just so I could save money. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's just so hard. And my heart goes out to all the people that find themselves in that position, in that situation. Yeah, it's so hard. And I know you had a really deep connection with Lindsay. It's very obvious, and she's so lucky that she had you. What's your insight as to why these relationships are so common?
well, I've thought about this, of course, and I mean, when I was speaking to a counselor after Lindsay died, I felt like I should have done something earlier. I should have intervened. And what she said to me is, she said that this counselor said, she said, well, again, she sort of used my own stuff. She said, well, Lindsay was a complete adult. She had her own decision. I'm like, I know. So, but she said that when basically the poop hit the fan, she relied on you. She relied on you. When her husband revealed his true self, my impulse was, please get this person out of her life completely. Time is short, the water is rising. Please, no, no, just not a single second. And I think that Lindsay really struggled with that because she saw that, like she didn't deny the way that it reacted. She was appalled and it was abhorrent. Everything from the, asking about money to the, just disgusting human being tactics, right? Things that really grated against her sense of what is right in the world, like a really strong sense of what is right in the world. And yet there's that sense of loyalty and that sense of, but he's nice to me sometimes. He can behave. He can behave. And that was, I think, confusing to her because he could come in and behave well, behave kindly, and she was lonely. She didn't have a huge group of friends, the small number of family members. We were all dancing as fast as we can, but it's scary and it's lonely. She didn't have a huge support system. She had lost her job the year before simply because the opportunity had shut down and she wasn't able to find something else because she was sick right away. So there was no other strong support system to step in and say, hey, we got you, girl. There was nobody else. So there was that isolation, that physical and social isolation. But Lindsay used to tell me, she used to, even in the interviews when you walk back, she says, a lot of autistic people end up in abusive relationships. And she would just sort of spout this off. And I went, huh, I wonder if she's trying to tell me. And when I was watching those interviews again, I thought, why didn't I listen? But then I think that she didn't see it as abusive until her own relationship as abusive, until he started, demanding money and demanding, she said, you are going to do this. I will pull you out of care. I will take you out of that place. You can't go to that rehab facility. I mean, these sort of things is like, wait, do people actually say these things? It's like, yeah, yeah, they do. They do. And it's abhorrent. And I think it happens a lot. And I think it actually probably happens to people who are not autistic as well.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the things that, again, to circle back to the advanced care planning, if you're a healthcare provider, you assume you've got a patient coming in that they're saying, yes, no, this is what I want. Let's question that. Are they actually making their own decisions? Or is there somebody in the background kind of talking to them saying, you can't do that because da, 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 da. So I think we need, as healthcare providers, to be more aware of our people. I mean, I think that we're sort of measuring capacity, but we're measuring intellectual capacity. But do people have the social, structural capacity to make their own decisions? Are they being supported to make their own decisions? And I think that's sort of part of the Lindsay story that we can take forward. And again, I would encourage your listeners to, if they're going into a healthcare system, either or a healthcare situation, either for themselves or for a loved one, to kind of lock that down. You don't need to lock down the decision because we don't know. A healthcare situation can evolve, devolve in, certain ways. We don't know. But what you can say is that no matter how this goes, I know that I can make my own decisions. Me and this person and that person, the three of us, the five of us, the 10 of us, or just me, I've got this. And if you tell me how and in this way and give me this information, I will be able to sort this out. And these are the people I trust to help me make decisions. And this is somebody who's kind of a little bit doesn't have my best interests in mind. And to be thinking about that going forward. So you don't need to decide necessarily, I will have that treatment. I won't have that treatment. Unless, I mean, if you feel very strongly about certain treatments, of course, that's your right. You have a right to feel that way. I will never do this. I will always do this. But most of us don't know how the story's going to go. But we do know who we want to walk with us, who we trust to walk with us. And that's what's worth sorting out. And that makes all the difference in the world, I think. And as support people for autistic people, that's what we can help kind of lock down. And it's worth going to lawyers and saying, hey, this is kind of looking a little sketchy. Can we get these legal documents? Can we get supported decision-making documents? Can we make sure that we've got trusted support people in this person's corner going forward? So that no matter how the story goes, that person's making the decision.
I know from when I was going through it, one of the first questions they ask, they ask you to bring, your partner in with you or another family member that's going to walk with you through the journey. And the person you bring in, they assume that that person has your best interests in mind, the person's on their best behavior. But at the same time, like I remember when I got my autism diagnosis, like the assessment process, part of it included talking with my partner, and they were very quickly able to determine, like just a psychiatrist, psychologist was quickly able to determine this person lacks interpersonal insight. And just a few questions help them determine that. And those could be infused in one of the first, cancer, appointments that you have. And someone can really identify that this person might not be the best person to help you make decisions, especially when you're in a lot of pain, when you're highly medicated for several months. So I don't know. I think that there can just be like small changes made that can make a huge difference in that initial part of that journey.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. But I mean, on the other hand, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because if I walk in with my partner and I'm like, this is my person, right? Whether it's my mother or my husband or my sister or whoever, I'm like, this is my person, and you're my healthcare provider, and you immediately start saying, well, how stable are they? right? And in what best interest? So then immediately we're having couple counseling or, family counseling. But you're right. In some ways, do you take if you are my healthcare provider and I'm your patient, are you going to just take my word for it? Or do you trust me that I've got all this stuff sorted out before I even walk in your door? But you're right. It's kind of a double-edged sword, but I agree with you that in some ways we almost need that, if this, then that kind of questioning. And I think part of it too is that at the beginning of a cancer story, nobody really imagines it's going to go terribly badly, right? I mean, I remember actually, because Lindsay was diagnosed at stage 4, she was handed a palliative care pamphlet. Or actually, her husband was handed a palliative care pamphlet, and he shoved it in his jacket pocket and said, "I'm not showing that to her." And I remember at the time, I was personally traumatized. I was just trying to like literally navigate her through this rabbit warren of this day long appointment is what it seemed. But palliative care can be very supportive from the beginning. It's not just end of life care, even though she had 4+ years after that. That can be that kind of psychosocial care, the kind of things that you're talking about. So you can ask for psychosocial referrals right off the bat. And that's the kind of entryway into maybe that more complex care that you're talking about. Saying, hey, can I have a psychosocial referral? Can I talk to a social worker, please? And if you're in one of these cancer centers, you have a right to ask for those things. And I would encourage, frankly, everybody to do that. And then you have somebody, and if you can, if you're able to attend those appointments, and sometimes they can be virtual, sometimes they can be in person, depending on, what your abilities are and your location, to talk about, hey, these people are in my corner, but I kind of wonder, or I wonder how this is going to go. And sometimes, and I think this was in Lindsay's case, and I think this is the case, things can be going along just fine. Things can be just kind of fine. There might be a few little pink flags, red flags, maybe, but things can be just fine until you have a crisis, right? Until you have a crisis like cancer or, a job loss or something like that. I would definitely ask for that social worker, ask for that psychosocial consult right away. And you should be able to receive that. And that might help, your listeners kind of sort through some of those questions early on and get some of that sorted out in their own mind. And then maybe like, I kind of need to rethink this. Who is going to be my person? Who's the person who's going to really be in my corner? Because that is one of the hardest thing as a caregiver is to put your own personal beliefs, hope, dream, fears, everything to the side and do what needs to be done for the patient, for the person who's actually sick. It's a really hard thing to do. So if you have someone in your corner who can do that for you, you're very fortunate. And you shouldn't have to do it all for yourself, but sometimes you do.
I know we're going over, but is there anything I haven't asked you about that you'd like to discuss?
If you're really interested and you want to watch the Lindsay interview project, you can watch all of us with the bad lighting and the cats and the snacks and the chit-chatting away and the bad questions and the rambling answers. We would love to have you just hang out with us. So that is available on YouTube. But really, please use the guide, talk about the guide. I hope that it's helpful and ask for it and use it. If there's any feedback about the guide or how you think it could be useful for other than cancer situations, I'd be very open to knowing about that as well. And I had to write the dedication for it. That was hard. But Lindsay used to say, "We wish you well on your journey." And that was a very Lindsay thing to say. So I will end with that. So if you are diagnosed with cancer and you are autistic, Lindsay would say, "I wish you well on your journey."
A huge thank you to Paula for being my guest on the Other Autism podcast. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time.